This is one building. Today, we examine a building that no longer exists. Queen's Walk Arcade once stood in central Melbourne. A narrow Victorian shopping arcade set inside the Victoria Building. Section 1. Geographic Context. Melbourne is the capital of the state of Victoria on Australia's southeastern coast. Along the southern edge of the central city runs the river that shaped Melbourne's early settlement. The streets of the city centre follow the Hoddle grid, surveyed in 1837. Within this grid stood Queen's Walk Arcade, near the intersection of Collins and Swanston Streets. This site lies between Melbourne Town Hall and St Paul's Cathedral, 1 block north of Melbourne's first railway station, Flinders Street. Section 2. Purpose and Commission. Queen's Walk began as a pedestrian lane running through the Victoria Building and connecting Collins Street with Swanston Street. Originally, the passage was open to the sky and lined with small shops, with entrances leading to offices and club rooms on the upper floors. Exposed to the weather and city drainage, the narrow lane could become unpleasant in the hot weather, with newspapers complaining of strong smells during summer heat. In November 1922, the owners redeveloped the lane as a modern covered shopping arcade. The works enclosed the passage beneath a glass roof and introduced new shop fronts along its length. After these changes, the passage became known as the Queen's Walk Arcade. Section 3. Historical Context and Authorship. The building was developed by the Freehold Investment and Banking Company during Melbourne's late 19th century land boom, when large commercial buildings were rising across the centre of the city. Designed by architect David Wormel, the building was completed in 1888 and occupied a prominent position in central Melbourne. Its elaborately ornamented facades were crowned with sculptural figures, including a statue of Queen Victoria holding an orb and sceptre high above the street atop a corner tower. Early photographs show a tall corner tower rising above the Swanston Street facade, originally topped by a slender spire that was removed in 1910. In 1922, the Melbourne architectural practice Sydney Smith, Ogg and Serpell was commissioned to redesign the internal passage as a modern shopping arcade. Before the reconstruction, the Government Tourist Bureau occupied rooms on the ground floor of the Victoria Building. During the 1922 works, these spaces were demolished and rebuilt as part of the new arcade, after which the Bureau returned to occupy a larger room opening into Queen's Walk. Section 4. Materials and Construction. The Victoria Building rose 5 stories and was constructed of brick with rendered facades facing the surrounding streets. The Queen's Walk Arcade formed a covered interior passage beneath a glass roof carried on iron framing. Shop fronts were framed in timber with large plate glass display windows set above polished bluestone bases, while inside the windows, deep counters were finished with moulded cowrie fronts and cedar tops. The ceilings used Traeger Velblek, a deep-profile corrugated iron system intended to improve fire resistance and described at the time as the first of its kind in Australia. For a building of its time, the Victoria Building incorporated modern services, including wired electric lighting, telephone connections, and Otis hydraulic lifts. Section 5. Overall Form and Appearance. Queen's Walk, followed an L-shaped route through the interior of the block. The passage formed a narrow corridor approximately 4 meters wide. From the Collins Street entrance, the arcade extended about 22 meters before turning right and continuing a further 18 meters towards Swanston Street. Timber-framed shopfronts lined both sides of the passage. Flat display windows and recessed doorways faced the corridor, creating a continuous row of shopfronts along its length. Above the shopfronts, a band of decorative glazing sat beneath projecting timber cornices that extended along the arcade. Most shopfronts were narrow retail units opening directly onto the passage. The Government Tourist Bureau occupied a larger room extending deeper into the building, its entrance marked by large arched double doors opening onto the arcade. The floor was paved with marble slabs bordered by narrow mosaic tiles, forming a continuous circuit along the passage, with a decorative tile inlay near the entrance spelling the words Queen's Walk. Above the street entrances, semi-domed glazed canopies projected from the building, marking the points where the arcade opened onto the street. Section 7. Light, Sound and Sensory Conditions. Entering from the street, the passage begins beneath a shallow vestibule ceiling lit by small skylights set above the doorway. Beyond the entrance, a large dome opens above the corridor before the roof continues beneath a long arched canopy of glass and iron. Daylight filtered through the roof and reflected from the marble paving and polished shopfront windows, brightening the narrow interior passage. Additional light was provided by suspended pendants hanging beneath the roof, illuminating the center of the walkway. Footsteps and voices echoed between the shop fronts and the hard surfaces of the corridor. The narrow passage concentrated light, sound, and movement within the space. Section 8 changes over time. Other than the creation of Queen's Walk Arcade in 1922, the next major change to the building came more than 40 years later. In 1966, Melbourne City Council purchased the Victoria Building as part of plans to create a civic square between Melbourne Town Hall and St Paul's Cathedral. Later that year, the Victoria Building and Queen's Walk Arcade were demolished by the Melbourne company Whelan the Wrecker, bringing an end to the complex after less than 80 years. The building was demolished using a wrecking ball. Several sculptural elements were removed as the building was dismantled. The statue of Queen Victoria that had once stood above the corner facade was made of cement over plaster and was destroyed during demolition, although its head was salvaged and taken to Whelan the Wrecker's yard in Brunswick. In the years that followed, the cleared block functioned as an open public space, while plans for a permanent square developed. During this period, Melbourne saw a succession of temporary squares on the site, and the open ground became a gathering place for public events and political demonstrations, with large crowds often filling the space beside the town hall. Plans for a permanent square evolved throughout the 1970s. During this process, the neighbouring Regent Theatre was also scheduled for demolition. Public opposition led to the theatre being retained, and its western wall became part of the final design of the square, where it remains today. A design competition to make the square attracted more than 100 entries, the winning proposal coming from the Melbourne architectural practice Denton Corker Marshall. The design introduced an open plaza with bluestone paving, water cascades, fountains, and a raised amphitheatre beneath a large canopy. The new square was officially opened on the 28th of May 1980 by Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, the great-great-granddaughter of Queen Victoria, the previous building's namesake. Section 9. Significance and Legacy. Queen's Walk formed part of the network of sheltered shopping arcades that once threaded through Melbourne's commercial centre, particularly around the Paris end of Collins Street. Although the Victoria Building and Queen's Walk were demolished in 1966, Melbourne's tradition of ornate Victorian arcades survives in places such as the Block and Royal Arcades. City Square occupied the site for several decades before closing again in 2017 during construction of the metro tunnel beneath the block. The square reopened in 2025 above Town Hall Station, with much of the original 1980 design removed during the redevelopment. Today, the space between St. Paul's Cathedral and the Melbourne Town Hall is still crossed by thousands of people each day. The buildings have changed, but the movement through the land remains. This was one building. Observed.
And in a little over half an hour from now, Her Majesty the Queen will officially open what the Council hopes will become one of the finest city squares in the world. Another landmark is the giant metal sculpture by Sydney artist Mr. Ron Robertson Swan, selected by architects as symbolising the open-air feeling of the square. Many councillors were horrified. One said it looked like a piece of leftover air conditioning equipment, but perhaps its yellow colour horrified them even more than the $70,000 price tag. And back to the modern, the video matrix screen, which makes use of the otherwise bare wall of the Regent Theatre. Some 25,000 light bulbs make up the computer-controlled screen that can show everything from news flashes to documentaries and special interest programs. This shot very clearly shows one of the aims of the designers of the city square. They wanted to provide a visual link between two of the great buildings of this part of the city, St. Paul's Cathedral and of course the Melbourne Town Hall. And this part of the city is no stranger at all to royalty. In fact, it was in 1867 that Prince Alfred, Duke of Edinburgh and the son of Queen Victoria, laid the foundation stone of the present Town Hall on the site of what was the old Crook's furniture store. And to give you an idea of rising costs, the Regent Theatre, which is now being refurbished at a cost of a couple of $1 million, was purchased, complete with frontage through to Flinders Lane, by one Thomas Napier in 1838 for £197. The old Argus building, of course, was on the site before the Regent.
My Lord Mayor, we are delighted to be with you today in this new centre of Melbourne. It is 10 years ago that we undertook our first walkabout in Australia in Collins Street, and I still remember vividly the novelty and excitement of that occasion.